Hello everyone. In this video we're going to talk about the basics of the Fusion 360 interface, some of the areas we're going to be working with, general movement and control functionality, and then just a little bit of discussion of future areas where we're going to move into in Fusion 360 so that we can try more advanced things. First, we should recognize that in order to keep all our models online and on the cloud, which is really convenient, we should have projects set up so we can contain all of our files. And so for our class, we might want to keep all of our stuff in one giant project, and we can have individual sub-projects within it, or we can have subfolders and things like that. So this is the general layout that Fusion 360 looks like. It may vary slightly if you're on a Mac computer versus a Windows computer, but generally speaking, everything should be in the same areas if you haven't changed any defaults. And so what we'll look for on the top left is this 9 little squares called the data panel. This is how we can open up projects, old projects, open up new ones, find files that we've saved, different models, different things, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and select it, and we'll see that it opens up a window that has a lot of different information. Right now I'm only showing a certain category of projects, but you just have to decide what you think or how you want to lay out your information as you go. It gives us some sample stuff. We'll ignore that for now. But most important, there's a new project button. We can create a folder level project. This is basically a container for different models and manipulations we might make. If I select it, it asks for a name. We can go ahead and do that. I'll call this, I'm going to call mine CAD. You can call yours CAD, T1, or you can put a year, you can put your name. Not important, because really, once you've made your models, as long as you have them, it's not so important for me to have access to them. You just have to have access to them. So that's kind of the key here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit CAD. I'm going to hit Enter on my keyboard, and there is my project. And there it is. And it went away mainly because I have it categorized, but I can always say owned by me, which are the ones that I've created, or I can do all possible projects. Because if you do want to share projects with other people, this is where you might do that. But what happens is now I'm going to go ahead and do this so we can see it owned by me, and we can see there's the CAD project. I'm going to make sure I have this one selected, and I think there it is. And I can even pin it so it's always on the top, so now if I do pinned, I have less stuff kind of sitting around, and there's my project. So I'm going to go ahead and close this window. I don't really need it open anymore because I'm within this project. And we can see our layout is basically a 3D environment. And now again, what we see is kind of perspective view right now. And the way we know or have a sense of where we are in 3D space, the most useful tool for this is on the top right, this cube that has kind of different numbers and pieces. You can hover over it. As you do that, it'll let you move the camera, right? This is kind of one of the things we have to be comfortable with, is being able to move the camera in 3D space around something, and so we can get different perspectives, front views, side views, angled views on our objects. And then there's always a home view, so that's why it's already on this, but if I click it, we can see that it puts me kind of this right, looking at the center point, we can see this kind of like an origin in 3D space. And this is a three-dimensional space, even though right now we're seeing kind of two at an angle. We're seeing an X and a Y, and we can see axes by these colors, right? The X-axis is the red line, the Y-axis is the green line, and even though we don't see it, there is a third kind of pointing up and down called the Z-axis. And actually, we can see it on the cube here. You can see that it's kind of giving us what we're looking at. And notice it says, oh, what's the front, what's the right, what's the top? And also, I'll go ahead and do this. I'm going to click on one of these. I'm going to click front. And now notice something, the grid stays, but it changes, and we can also see the change in color of our axes. So now we're looking at, and again, the cube really helps us have a sense of this. The X-axis is kind of going from left to right, and the up and down is the Z-axis. And again, we're looking, again, it looks flat, but the reality is we're looking forward into it. You can imagine forward looking at our object. The reality is, it's not important what you consider front and back. Fusion 360 has its own default like directions, but it's like an infinite 3D space. So really where the front is not important. If you happen to design your object so where the front of your object is facing the back direction of Fusion 360, that's not really an issue. What's important is that the measurements are correct and that you can see everything and that there's no kind of issues in that area. But if the forward and backwards and left and right are not matching your objects for front and back and so on, that's not that important. It's not the end of the world if that's not okay. We'll try, as we create our examples and sketches, try to be consistent, and it would be nice to have it that way, but if it's not that way, it's not really that big of a deal. And so again, this is back, I'm going to go back to the home view. If I hover over this, I can click on the house, and it'll give me that kind of perspective. So some things to note, some commands that I'll use or shortcuts I'll use are based on using a mouse. I'm using a mouse right now, but if you use a trackpad on a keyboard, on a laptop, which is a very common thing to do for I think most of us, then things might vary differently. And so the reality is that we also have the ability to control this 3D space, and it is a little more tedious with the trackpad, but we can do anything with the mouse or with the trackpad. It's just knowing how to do it. The three main things we want to do are rotate around our point in space, pan or move up and down, forward and backwards in space, and then zoom in and out of 3D space so we can see something. And we can in fact see there are different buttons for these things, right? So the first one is what's called orbiting. I said rotate, but really it's called an orbit, and you orbit around a particular space. With the mouse, it is actually really easy to do, and so I can hold the control key on my keyboard and then use my middle button if there is one, and you can see it kind of, shift, not control, the shift button, and you can see that the pointer has become like this kind of, looks like an atom, like a little cross with these kind of curved lines around it, and you can see that I'm rotating, and you can see that plane is in 3D. It's not just a flat sheet of paper, it's actually a plane in 3D space, and it rotates its perspective, kind of shifts it, right? If I let go of shift, there it is. If I don't use shift, if I just use the middle button with the mouse, I can pan, it looks like a hand. It's like grabbing a sheet of paper, grabbing the screen and sliding. So if you want to move what you're looking at, you can do that. So one thing that's also convenient for orbiting is if you don't have a mouse and you're using a trackpad, you can click the button, but it's a little tedious that way. Instead, you can simply grab with your trackpad the cube and also drag and rotate. So you can see now as I grab and move around my mouse with the cube, I'm also changing my view. And you can see that they always are in sync as we go. Right? So that's one thing that's kind of convenient. Now what I'll say is if I pan, I can also click the button, and if I have this hand, I can drag. And then now I'm stuck on this kind of hand when I use the buttons. That's one limitation. They don't kind of go away. You have to hit escape on your keyboard to kind of go back to the plain mouse. And now if I do the same thing in drag, notice something. One key difference is that the rotation, it always tells us where kind of the pivot point is. What are we spinning around? What are we kind of orbiting around? And here it shows that little green dot that says pivot. That's what we're rotating around. So if the object is over here, but we've panned to the side, you're rotating around this area and not necessarily the object. So that's just something we have to be aware of and we have to be comfortable with. For zooming, it's pretty easy to do. On a mouse, you can use your scroll wheel, and typically you'll zoom in and zoom out. The default behavior, and I'm going to change it in the future, and you can decide if you want to or not. If you scroll up, right, if you're scrolling up, it actually zooms out. If you scroll down, it actually zooms in. And you can see as you zoom in, this grid might change. The grid is going to help us with measurements as we go. You can see it gets more fine, and eventually you're going to see that these squares are really big. So I'm kind of really zoomed in. But it depends on how large the object is you're creating. So those are key features that we're going to use. These are the most things we have to be most comfortable with is moving around freely in 3D space. And one last thing we should always do is just click home to put us back. It zooms us out. It puts us back seeing the origin point. And generally speaking, we make our objects starting somewhere near the origin so it's easier to manage. The last thing I'll say in this video, we are using one of many sections in Fusion 360. The first and kind of most commonly used area is what's called the design bar. And we can see this button here. It's a workspace or bar, and there are a lot of different ones. So design, generative design, the rendering workspace, animations, simulations, manufacturing, and then the drawing. And so there's a lot of them. Really, design is where most of our time is going to spend, especially as beginners. We really want to just get comfortable designing things, and then the more advanced tools we can maybe move into. So all of these buttons are in the workspace for design is what we're going to stick to most of the time, and we'll maybe eventually transition. And so a lot of the different tools, each of these is a menu. If there's a little black arrow, there's a drop down, there's tons of options. There's just so many things. One nice thing that Fusion 360 does for us, it gives us many ways of doing the same thing. So I can create objects, I can draw my sketches, all these things with multiple key presses on a keyboard if you don't like using your mouse or trackpad, or you can use movements with your mouse, clicking and dragging. There's just so many different ways of doing the same thing. You do what's best for you, what you're most comfortable and efficient with. And as you use it more, you'll become more comfortable with it. So in future videos, as we learn tools, we'll see more of these menus and we'll go through them and so on. So I'll see you in the next video, and we'll have a good time creating something new.